Well, thank you all for joining part 2 of the Spectra U educational series focused on food and beverage operations in casinos. My name is Blair Kahora, and I'm the Vice President of Communications with Spectra, and I'll be moderating today's panel. Today we're going to focus on developing a new F&B program. I am joined by 4 esteemed industry experts. I'm going to ask each panelist to give a brief introduction to tell us about their background and their area of expertise. So let's start with John Phillipp, the Executive General Manager at Ho-Chunk Gaming Wisconsin Dells.
Hello, everybody. My name is John Phillipp.
You have disabled sounds.
I am the Executive Manager at Ho-Chunk Gaming Wisconsin Dells. I've been recently in this position and excited to be here and working with Spectra. I have an extensive gaming background and worked with many big corporations, and I've been in Indian gaming now for about 9 years, and it's been great. A little bit of education behind me, and excited to be here and excited to join this conference call today.
Great, thanks, John. We're excited to have you join as well. Next, I'm going to ask Michael Laffey, who's President of Indigeony Marketing Group, to give himself a brief introduction as well.
Hey, good to see you all. I'm glad I can participate today as well with the Spectra guys. Like you said, my name is Michael. I've been in the gaming industry for, I think it's a little over 24 years now. Started out cutting my teeth in the card rooms of Seattle. I've been a director of marketing at some large properties across the United States and spent the last decade of my career as a consultant and a marketing agency and all those kind of things. And really like to see the direction that food and beverage is taking in the gaming space right now.
Fantastic. We're looking forward to hearing all the valuable insight that you're going to add today. Now I'm going to turn it over to our 2 panelists from Spectra who operate in the casino division. First is Mike Ducey, Regional Vice President of our casino division. Mike, would you like to give a brief introduction about yourself?
Sure, thanks. Appreciate it. Been in the gaming space, travel gaming specifically, for well over a decade now. And I've been working with Spectra Food Services for over 16 years. In that time, I've had an opportunity to work in a lot of different types of services that we provide as a company, but have thoroughly enjoyed the past 10 years of working in the gaming division and travel gaming specifically. And overall, I've been working in food and beverage for well over 24 years. It's my background in total, and really enjoy and appreciate the time today, Blair, getting together with everyone.
Fantastic. And now Josh, who is our Executive Director of Casino Projects. Josh, can you give a little bit of background on yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I've been with Spectra in the gaming division for about 6 years. I've had the opportunity to work in about all of our casino venues from a director standpoint all the way to some finance, accounting support, and an opportunity to work with all the directors in all of our properties. So I look forward to discussing our topics this morning, Blair.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to the 4 of you. I will remind the panelists to ID themselves before they make their feedback and commentary and insights, just so our attendees know who is speaking. I'm going to ask Mike Ducey first to give a quick recap of part 1, which we hosted back in June. A lot of the folks were able to join us for part 1, but for those of
disabled sounds.
But for those of us who weren't able to join for part 1, can you get us up to speed, Mike, before we delve into part 2?
Sure, thanks. Feels like yesterday, it was back in June, wow. The concept we really came up with was in total a 4-part series of looking at food and beverage, and much of this came out of conversations with folks like John and some of our other clients, and Mike Laffey and his company, and identifying, how food and beverage is, how it fits into the total organization of a casino, and it's not simply just putting food on plates. There's a lot more complexity to it these days. There's different opinions on the amenity versus profit generator. So we started identifying a series of topics that we thought really would be great for the 4-part series. And in our first part, we talked about really the high-level governance of a F&B program, investing in the program, and what types of questions the group would have to ask from perhaps the elected official leadership to the casino management team, and then into the capabilities of the facility itself. So what can and cannot the facility support? You simply, some restaurants can't fit in the facility if the certain aspects of the facility aren't there. So we actually had an architect on the call talking about those parts of the identifiables. So we had a good conversation about how to be realistic in your goal setting and determining what can be done. And I think that kind of leads us to today, where we're going to be able to talk some more about the aspects of the strategy itself. So once you've identified, yes, we can build a restaurant, we have the space, we have the funding, we have the infrastructure. What goes in there? Is it fine dining? Is it mid casual? How does that all come together? So some of those things we're going to talk about today, and then segue into our next couple of webinars that we'll do in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you for the recap. Now, jumping into part two, we're basically focusing now, we're taking the next step, developing a new food and beverage program. The purpose here is to really drill down on the specific brands, cuisines, and menus that are really going to elevate a casino's F&B operation to really differentiate that casino in a really competitive marketplace. We're gonna hit several different discussion topics. Firstly, we're going to hit the steps and data when considering potential concept changes. Then subsequently, the process and timeline from project inception to opening. Then the ever-important collaboration between food and beverage marketing and other departments, and how you can play nice in the sandbox and really aim for the same mission, the organizational mission. And number 4, communicating the new concept or change with internal employees and the local community, both of which are incredibly important. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about data utilization. So Michael Laffey, I'm going to turn it over to you first. We're building a strategy. Where do we start?
Well, one of the beautiful things about working in the gaming space is that we have this unbelievable access to data that is just more powerful than almost any industry out there. We know data-wise when you visit, how much you spend, when your birthday is, when your anniversary is, what machine you like, all the wonderful things when it comes to the gaming floor. What we need to start thinking about, since food and beverage is no longer an amenity to gaming, it's an independent revenue stream, we need to start using that same data acquisition process to collect and make informed decisions on food and beverage. Not only does that come from these big, wonderful computers that we use in the data collection that we have, but we also have player development departments that can reach out specifically and gather wonderful information from our players and our visitors that can help us make more informed decisions instead of simply saying, I like brand X, so we should bring that in here. You know, that's basically what we want to do, is take all this wonderful technology and personal interaction that we have with guests and apply it to the F&B department the same way we do to the gaming floor.
Fantastic. And Mike or Josh, what do you have to add to that, to Michael's sentiments?
So I want to add in, I think it's really important that we look at the trends in areas such as redemption of coupons and, really where the guests are looking to dine and what their desires are. I think all too often we tend to get caught up in personal preferences in food and beverage versus what the guest is actually looking for. And ultimately, as we begin to develop these brands and move forward, I think it's important that we focus on exactly what the guest is looking for and not what we personally feel is the best fit. I think all too often, there's a thought of a casino should have a buffet and a steakhouse and a diner-style restaurant, and that ultimately may not be the fit in the type of casino you are managing at the time. So I think, therefore, looking into the data, as Michael Laff explained earlier, becomes even more focused and more important looking into future expansion.
And what happens when you don't pay attention to the data? Do you have examples of teams who have ignored the data that they have, and what the repercussions have been?
Yeah, I think that the answer to that is really, the first bullet that we have there is talking about feasibility studies and being realistic to, the volume that you can support, right? So The mistakes that can be made could be, for example, a buffet, as Josh mentioned. If the buffet can't support volume, your desire to have quality, full pans of food, the exchange of the food to keep it wholesome from the time it opens to the time it closes becomes at risk, because you're going to continue to have to change out those pans throughout the day. As a very finite example, in a buffet, and yet you may not have the volume to support that rotation. So regardless of the guests coming, you're constantly pushing food and throwing it out. It just won't hold forever, just like at home. You can't leave food out. So those types of pieces of the feasibility study and that volume aspect is pretty important. And there have been times where, to Josh's point, decisions have been made to say, well, but everybody has a buffet, so we must have a buffet. Or the casino down the road has a buffet, so therefore we engage in kind of a Cold War mentality, right? Where they have this, so we have to have this, and that's not always an accurate way to go. Sometimes you should think along on different lines to not be the same, right? To differentiate yourself from the other products. And John, with all apologies to gaming, in fairness, and I probably said this during our last webinar, right? Slots machines are very similar at most casinos. There's a number of vendors out there that you're buying from, and the machines and the products that you can buy. So what's the differentiator oftentimes is your marketing program, your food program. So hitting that mark is important on a number of levels. And then one other quick question I might even ask back to John and to Mike Laffey. Mike, you mentioned talking about in the early days of the data is looking at the profitability of food and beverage versus that as using it as an amenity where there could be a loss. I think that's a really important decision that you have to make at some point, because you're having to determine, based on your data, can you be profitable, right? Do you have the environment based on your feasibility study that restaurant can ever generate revenue, or is it always going to be based upon a player return on investment because it's an amenity service? And those are things I know you guys have to work on quite a bit in your marketing and general manager roles, and we kind of follow suit in food and beverage, but it is something we see kind of common. So I kind of throw back a point to you guys a little bit there.
Mike, this is Michael, and John could probably attest to this too. I've had several places have an individual food and beverage manager that really kind of understood the relationship between gaming, marketing, and F&B. And he once told me, if marketing isn't my first customer, then I'm doing it wrong. And that's okay. You have to put that into your player reinvestment system, figure out between your CEO and CFO whether you're charging marketing full retail for that menu item for a comped guest. All of that stuff comes down to, does the data tell us to do this? Does the guest tell us to do this? Or are we just throwing it out there to see what sticks? I think if you can marry data, marketing, and food and beverage, you're going to benefit from profit instead of loss leading, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is John Phillipp. Hey, just one thing, Mike, you touched something in my mind when you were talking about the slot machines and table games, and I often describe it as we all have slot machines, we all have tables, we all have ugly carpet, but the differentiators are what kind of service are we providing, and what kind of food outlets, and what kind of additional amenities are we providing. That's the difference. The gaming side of it is very similar from property to property. So if you've got a great food hook that you can draw people in with that hook, it really does help our business. And I think the comment about marketing being your number one customer is certainly true. We use the data. We reward players with food. And actually, I've actually had some complaints about, this is too much food. I can't eat X so many times, right? And they're getting 150 a week in food, while you go to the grill, and how much food can you eat at a small grill, or even in the steakhouse. So yeah, there's they love getting the food though. That's for sure.
John, can you elaborate a little bit on that as far as what you saw as the players were using these offers? What did you discover with where their money was being spent? Did you see any patterns?
Well, we do a lot of directing, so we create the patterns pretty much. And also it depends upon the level of the play, right? So if you've got your top end player, you're not going to give him $5 to the grill. You're going to give him $150 to the steakhouse, in addition to additional money that they can spend on other locations when the steakhouse is closed. So we do direct that somewhat, but there's also a natural migration. Typically, gamblers don't want to, when they're playing, they want to gamble, and they don't necessarily want to sit down and do a 7-course meal, or they want to grab and go a lot of the time. So we make that available to them as well, because we want to keep them in action. The worst thing that we could do is pull people off a machine and have them sit in a restaurant for 3 hours, get tired, and leave. We want them to, grab the food, go, get back on their game, and that's really why we exist, honestly.
Great. And Josh, I remember you had mentioned, I believe there was a data point regarding a Mexican restaurant that you would put into a casino, a Spectra-run casino, and regarding redemption rates. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to, Blair, is a casino that we have that we can currently work with that really had a large shift most recently in their dining outlets. We recognized the need to put in a more local, regional type cuisine into an outlet where a steakhouse had currently sat. In identifying the need for that change, we also identified the need of the players to still have that steak option available to them in the newly renovated and open restaurant, but not theming the entire concept around a steakhouse brand or at the price point of the steakhouse. So I think through working with the marketing team on site at that property, we were able to really focus on the guest desires and needs in terms of cuisine, but also we're able to focus on the price point they were looking for to keep it within the spending range, not only coming out of their pocket, but with the comps that they have available to use on site at the property.
Right. A restaurant is a storybook, right? It has a beginning and an end and everything in between. The cover of the restaurant, like the cover of the book, kind of draws you in. And if you build a steakhouse and your guests aren't really in tune with that, or in this case, as Josh talks about this particular restaurant, when you walked inside, there were cases, empty cases, but cases on display of fantastic Super Tuscans out of Italy and California wines, and they weren't selling. They weren't going to sell, and that's fine. No worries with that. These are wines that most of us wouldn't buy at a steakhouse dinner, to be honest with you, as they were sometimes $200 to $300 retail a bottle. That's really not the right fit. Now, obviously, somebody thought, well, I need a steakhouse. I need to put in a steakhouse because that's what casinos do. In this case, no one was comfortable sitting in there. They didn't know what those wines were. They didn't know how to. They weren't comfortable ordering a dinner at a white tablecloth restaurant. The service staff, the service staff was unfamiliar with fine dining. A fine dining server could work in the industry for decades to become a fine dining server, to learn single malt scotches, wines, the cuts of beef, to be able to sell that as a server. They are salespeople. They're not just servers. To sell that comfortably, if they haven't had that worldly experience, then you're not going to execute that well. But they didn't need to, because the guests, like the servers from the market they were in, simply needed good comfort food, right? They needed food that was destined. Then it fell together, and the volume's up.
There's definitely a regional factor when you consider this as well. What works in the South is not going to work in Wisconsin, right? You have to, almost tailor to, we need cheese curds here and grits down south. So both of those things are not going to transfer very well when you look at your menus and look at your outlets.
Right. I think that there's oftentimes, to that point, John, a look at brands nationally, right? The big national chains that have proliferated in all markets. If you really study those menus, they're really very simple in some sense, like an Olive Garden, right? Olive Garden is Italian pasta, fresh pasta, the salad, the breadsticks, right? You can find an Olive Garden in most cities, South, Wisconsin, California, but it is a fairly well-known and established food. So if you look at the chains are really based around those foods that you would call truly national in presence. Whereas the casinos are still drawing on a regional side. Even if they have a hotel resort, they're looking for an experience that's a little bit different than those national-based foods. We talked about this a little bit later, but that brand selection becomes very important, because some of those brands, just because they're out there, doesn't mean that they should necessarily be in a casino. Just because you see, we talked about the steakhouse, but even in the mid-casual realm, just because you see a certain type or style of a restaurant, sports bars seem to be the one that's out there quite a bit, may not work out. It may not be something that you want guests sitting there watching football for 4 hours on a Sunday afternoon, drinking beer when they should be out playing. So I think there's a series of aspects that come up with your comments about regional foods that we really have to drive into.
Great. So it sounds like food is no longer a loss leader. It really is a differentiator in food, service, other amenities, that these are the differentiators, but you have to do it the right way. You have to marry data and marketing to really make sure you're providing what the customer, what your visitor, what your players want. You want to provide an expected experience, and most importantly, you want to place guest preferences above personal preferences of the casino leadership, and then also eliminate emotional decision making. Does that sound like a fair recap?
Most definitely, particularly being pragmatic in your decisions.
Fantastic. Well, let's jump down to project planning. A wise man once said, you don't build a restaurant with a casino attached, you build a casino with a restaurant attached. Then the mission of the casino, how do we get all the parts aligned so that it really is focusing on the mission of the casino? How do you put a plan in place to make informed decisions? We've got the data, so what do we do next to kickstart the planning process?
John, you want to take a stab at that, or maybe I could say, and I know you want to talk a lot about the communication of that, and I think that's key. We're going to talk extensively about that. I think Blair, from a food perspective, it's assigning the project team who is going to be the ultimate decision makers for the recommendations, taking the data, from its course of action. And the reason I view that as important is because, again, for all the things that we talked about in data, for the capabilities of the staff, as we talked about in our first webinar, the capabilities of the facility and what capital you have, if those pieces aren't well established and ingrained, and at some point during the project planning, someone has a go-back decision and says, now, you know what, we want to build a yard house type restaurant. Well, yard house type restaurant with all those expensive beer lines and equipment, that could be millions more than you originally anticipated. So you have to continue to make sure you have established a leadership team that's grounded in the realities of what you can accomplish. If you have $500,000, you're probably just doing a facelift. If you have $5 million, you could be building a yard house. It really just depends on where that comes into play and what you need to do. So having that project leadership team, to me, is so key, because you have to be able to allow them to move the project forward and not get thrown into what we often call scope creep, where you're getting the curveball thrown after the decisions are made, and then you have to revisit those curveballs. It can drag out your project, and then you're missing your opportunity of those future sales and what you set out to do originally, right?
I think putting a stake in the ground once all the data research and all that has happened, you put a stake in the ground and say, okay, we're done making any changes. We're not even going to entertain any changes. We just have to be, stuck on this right now, because you're right, Mike. It'll take away, future revenue if you're dragging and stalling, and some people may actually try to stall you that way. But I think it's really important, and having done a number of big projects in casino land, owning that, putting the stake in the sand, not letting any creep happen to the project. Somebody has to be paying attention to it at all times. They have to own that project, and honestly, if you don't, the contractors are looking for people that are not paying attention because they're going to start putting in change orders and other, ways that they're going to make more money, but end up messing up your project.
I agree. And not to mention, Mike, I'm sorry, but not to mention, and this isn't for our talk today, we're going to talk about it extensively in our next webinar, but just to introduce it, keeping in mind that that project timeline and all the decisions of what we're going to do still has to be executed on a basic operations level by team members and food and beverage managers. And that's going to be a part of a future conversation we're going to have in this series. But consider that timing. You're oftentimes taking servers who may have for years worked in a fast food outlet or a basic concession type environment, tied to a bingo hall or maybe next to a poker, and all of a sudden you're saying, we're building a restaurant and we're going to keep everyone employed. And by the way, even though for years you've been a cashier at a McDonald's type concept, we're now going to have you serving tables. It's a whole different discipline. You're talking about, in our industry, years of experience that you're trying to then instill in just a matter of months, right? That people choose to be fast food workers, people choose to be front of house servers. It's a very different discipline. I mean, you're talking about electricians and plumbers. That's how different it is.
I think you both said it there. The importance of establishing parameters, not only in the project, but also in the timelines. I think, they need to be realistic in the expectations to really fulfill the project. But also, as we know, stakeholders are always trying to push the project along, and we want to, make sure we establish those key dates and key goals in those timelines in order to be successful in being able to achieve the expected results.
One last thing on this is time is your friend when you're doing a project, and a lot of times people will try to, I'm going to be a hero because I'm going to get this done in 90 days or 120 days. But you always want to give yourself enough wiggle room because vendors mess up, and you're going to need that wiggle room in that space. So every project I've done, I've always sandbagged my timelines just because of that fact that, stuff gets sideways, and you want to make sure that you don't miss your final deadline because of over-aggressive planning.
Yeah, that's a great point. A brand, and we're going to talk about exploring potential brands, I know, but think about a brand. If you do choose to bring in a national brand or some type of even semi-regional brand, you can take up to a year to process from the point that you receive what are called FDDs, franchise disclosure documents. If it's a franchise, it could take up to a year from the point that you sign for FDDs, the time that you open that door, and that's if it's on a fast track, right? So even that decision for the leadership team is important. If you're on you're on a timeline established by the governance of the capital and when you can spend it, if you say, well, and we want to bring in, back to my Olive Garden, that's a bad example because they don't do that, but if they could, to bring in an Olive Garden, you're usually talking that type of restaurant would take about a year to put in. There are abilities to go faster. It's not always that way, but it does take time because you're relying on a third party. You're relying on the franchisee or licensee. You're relying on their vendors. You're relying on their architects, their legal team, et cetera, their trainers, and they fit you into a queue of when they can open up restaurants because their resources are finite, right? They can only put together training teams for so many openings at so much of an interval, and we might say, well, we want it open in 6 months. They say, well, no, we've got 10 other restaurants opening up. So, and they're not going to hire an extra team just for us, right? So there's a whole series of things that I think come up in the project planning decision, and that's why we're always very careful about brands themselves. I don't know if I want to jump into that topic, but we're very careful. What is the value of a branded restaurant versus a internal or creative brand? I see we have the Panda Express up on the picture, a great brand. It's done gangbusters. I mean, they have been fantastic in casinos that we've operated in. I know Stations uses them quite a bit in their properties. I believe, John, that sounds about right. Do you need that, or could you find a local, regional Asian brand? Could you create your own Asian brand, and would you get the same impact from that? Those are questions that we often, as food guys, are asking. Marketing guys like Laffey. I don't know, Mike, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, when it comes to brand, I mean, you ask people what does a brand mean? Well, you ask a CFO, it's everything in the marketing budget that doesn't have an ROI must be branding. We got to account for it somehow. But really what brands are, the number one rule when it comes to that is it's not what you sell, it's what you stand for. So does this brand that you're considering bringing in align with the brand values that you have as a property? That is the biggest question. If your council or your executive team went to some conference somewhere and saw a mechanical bull and said, my goodness, we need one of those in our bar, do you? Is that really what you're trying to promote? Is that what you're trying to say that you stand for? It's really hard to be an upscale Lexus in the parking lot casino with a mechanical bull in your bar. They just don't match. It's just, you have to really be conscious of it. And another thing about brands, specifically in Indian country, is because we always have two audiences. We have the people that we're trying to attract to the property, and we have the tribal council. And when you try to bring in a brand that has certain rules to a tribal council, they really don't want to be told what those rules are. This is their property. This is their legacy. And when you say, if you want a brand X in here, you have to execute it this way, it doesn't always work.
I can't agree more with that statement. The brands really can, and they have the right to protect their product intelligence to put those rules and regulations. Short of a few business decisions of your pricing, although they sometimes like to make you believe they can dictate your pricing, they can't do that. The brands can't do that. You can set your own pricing, but beyond that, what you're purchasing, how you sell it, the uniforms, the look and feel of the outlet, the equipment that you purchase. If you have an equipment provider, you're going to have to line up to their equipment and purchase those things. Again, I'm not saying brands are negative, national brands or even some regional brands. In fact, I actually think there are times that they make sense, but it is part of this process of the project planning really to identify that. And John, to your point, is not making that last forever, so we get back to the revenue generation and we make those decisions quickly. And it's, the stake in the ground comment was a great one. That's exactly right.
Well, how do you deal with
brands can work both ways. Sorry, this is Michael again. I mean, I'm not saying that it's a negative thing to bring in brands. There's been several properties that I've worked on where the brand we brought in taught us a thing or two about guest service. I mean, their service standards are so far above ours that we learn from them. So there's an opportunity to do that depending on what the brand is.
And then based on, Mike, you had said, based on different brands that you may want to bring in there and work with, that they may need a longer runway than anticipated. And you're trying to set realistic timelines with the brands that you do want to bring in there. What do you do when you get pushback internally on that timeline?
You have careful conversations. If it's an internal brand, the timeline is generally going to be ours. We've from my experience, I know Josh would speak the same. From an internal brand, it doesn't take very long for us because we're a food service company to put together a brand in a short order, with logo and brand rules, and we partner up with the casino marketing. Sometimes those brands are bespoke for the casino, so it's something specific for that casino and only that casino, right? John and I were chatting a little bit earlier, and we have a chef that could work through a couple of our different scenarios that can come to him and say, hey, this could work, and leverage the efficiencies that are gained in creating an in-house brand. The national brands, pushing back at them for their timeline, yeah, absolutely, it's a business. You should. I mean, you should always push towards what you want in any deal. That's a fair statement. But back to the point of their limitations, they're in a business, right? They have a margin they want to hit nationally. All those national brands do is they're receiving royalties from all of us in the field that are running the restaurants. So those royalties are, to use the casino term, they're kind of on the if-come, right? There is risk involved for them as the owner-operator of the franchise parent as to how much resources they can employ in their corporate office to support how quickly they can help us push out restaurants. So they're balancing that. So you can push, but they're still going to say, again, I don't have the teams to do this right now, the internal design teams or equipment buyers or whatever else they need to do to support it. So, yeah, should you push? Yes. Will you get results? Yeah, you will. I mean, everything's a negotiation. Will it be ever as fast as you hope? Hard to say.
Yeah, that's a fair and valid point. So is there anything else on project planning we wanted to cover? I know we covered a lot of ground just then, from brands to timelines to establishing the project leadership team. Before we move on to communicating all of these changes, any important points that we missed that we should touch on?
Probably that ROI. Mine might make a comment from my perspective. I don't know how that drives through to the actual player reinvestments that John, you guys look at, or Mike Laffey, you would advise in your role. So maybe I'm not speaking towards ROI, but the overall budget. Again, going back to our conversations earlier, and John, you said, well, the change orders, the costs. These pieces do drive a cost issue as you make decisions. There's essentially a theory of project management that talks about a three-sided a triangle, and if you look at that triangle, and on one side you have scope, and on one side you have human resources, and on one side you have your budget for the project, if you try to shorten the budget, you're going to lengthen your timeline. Or if you try to shorten your, if you try to expand your scope naturally in the triangle, that means something else is going to expand too, which is probably your budget. So all of these things are a delicate balance. Unless there's an unending well of capital reserves that you're using for the project, you have to be very careful that the planning is always thinking about the original budget in mind. Because here's a good example. If you say, I'm going to build a restaurant, and then you say, and it's going to have a big bar, but you've done that after you've already designed and figured out what your capital is, that could bring in another $500,000 to $1 million, whatever you're doing in costs, and then you're almost faced with going, oh, I can't do that, and then you have to go back to square one again. That could be weeks, if not months, with architectural costs and things that you've sunk, and then you're bringing that back forward. So staying disciplined, to me, is the biggest part of the ROI discussion. I think it means something different probably to John and Mike Laffey, though.
This is John Phillipp again. I think it all circles back to the feasibility study, right? You can have, if you designed this restaurant and then all of a sudden you want to add a bar, was that supported by the feasibility study? Is it telling you that you need additional bar seats in your outlet, or is that just somebody's personal preference, which you guys touched on earlier, that somebody said, oh, I really want to put a nice cool bar in there, but it makes no sense to the business. You're going to get a negative ROI most likely on a decision like that because it wasn't feasible and it wasn't planned in, and it's going to make your project go sideways.
Right.
Seen it too many times.
And
closed restaurants, right? Restaurants that have opened up that have been shuttered.
Yeah, they're beautiful, but they're closed.
Well, that's, I guess, an unfortunate consequence of, making uninformed decisions. And, it speaks to the whole process and making sure, that you're staying on task and staying according to plan. So clearly, there are a lot of different stakeholders, whether it's the customer or the tribal council or employees or the community or your vendors. So how do we get them? As a communicator myself, I understand the critical importance of communication with these key stakeholders. John, how do we tackle this mammoth and often sensitive task? How do you do it at Ho-Chunk?
Well, and this is a subject that's very near and dear to me, because I think the success that you're going to have coming into a business, whether it's as the new GM or whether it's a new business coming inside of another business, is great communication. And we did a survey early on when I got here, and it was the number one problem was communication. And the interesting thing is it wasn't necessarily communication coming from down to the staff. It was actually communication within the department. So I thought that was an interesting wrinkle that I actually had never seen that happen before. But but you really have to build credibility. If we don't be credible right off the bat, if we're not, and there's a bullet at the end of this that talks about the empty suit. If you go out there and you start promising everything under the sun and you can't deliver, you end up being that empty suit, and it's not where you want to be. You want to be able to offer what you know you can deliver and then deliver, so you build credibility with the team, because ultimately that communication is trying to get you followers that are going to now become part of your team. And it doesn't just happen. Having a communication strategy is probably the most important thing we do. And I know when Spectra came in here, there was a series of communications touch points, with all the stakeholders. It was really, really good. And as the casino operator, I have to do the same thing with my team at all different levels. So you need a strategic plan. You need to say, okay, we're going to open all the channels of communication, and this is on the next slide. But you open up all the channels of communication. You have roundtables, you have one-on-ones, you have an intranet, you have a newsletter, you have employee rallies. You do all those things for one purpose, and that's to build credibility with the staff. So it's really an exciting time, because we're right in the middle of this right now, having an opportunity to change what was really poor communication in the past and to bring it around. And we're already seeing some of the fruits of that by better customer service, better trust, better job enjoyment. There's so many things that grow from great communication. You also got to touch all your stakeholders. I think a mistake that I made early on in my gaming career was I would focus on the directors and managers, and I'd be like, okay, well, this is my core team, and these are the people that I really need to push and impact, and then they'll spread it out through the ranks, and that's just not the case. You can get some of that, but ultimately you've got to talk to the line level employees, because they're going to tell you the truth. Honestly, the managers, here's what they tell me: everything's wonderful, everything's great, everything's perfect, John. Don't worry about me. Just get out of my way, right? They don't want the manager looking into their business. But when you start digging into the business and you start digging into what do the team say, what do the line level employees say, I ask them one question when I do a roundtable. I say, how can I make your job better? And for the next hour, I take notes, and they'll tell you exactly how you can make your job better. But the key to that is then you got to use it. You can't just gather that information. And again, going back to credibility, if you gather that information, then don't do anything with it, then you're the empty suit. You're not taking. So when you do get that data, you look at it and say, okay, here are the top 5 things I can fix, and you go fix those right away. And all of a sudden, they're like, wow, this guy actually listened to us. They're taking action, and they're actually moving the business forward. Everybody knows we get these, I call them business terrorists, those negative people that no matter what you do, no matter what you say, they're just going to be a nightmare for you. And what I've learned with those people is that you just give them no time. I've gotten to the point now where I manage people, I manage the stars. Those are the people that are going to get us somewhere. So I put all my energy and all my effort into those that are going to go ahead and move the business forward. But I call them business apostles. But the business terrorists, they're not going to do anything for you. They're going to actually subvert what you're trying to do. They're going to sabotage what you do, and they're actually out looking for ways to bring people into their chaos, bring people into their drama, and they get people to follow them, and it's really scary. But those people, A, got to go away, but B, you have to manage them by not giving them too much oxygen. You got to smother them metaphorically, right? I don't really want you to smother them, actually, but
we don't condone that on this webinar.
And then the Informal Leaders is another great group. Everybody knows that. You've got I'll just take slot attendants for example. I've got a group of slot attendants that there are natural, informal leaders in that group that people follow. And you've got to identify those people early on, because they can make a great influence into the whole communication strategy that you're trying to roll out. And lastly on this is, again, promise only what you can deliver. Don't go in there and say, I'm going to give you all weekends off. I'm going to give you new uniforms. You're all going to get a raise, right? Because when you can't deliver on that, you're the empty suit, and there's no credibility at all. And it makes your life very, very difficult. So using a communication strategy to get the team on your side. Once you get them on your side, even if it's 51% on your side, now you can really start moving the business and you can make a major impact. Now your initiatives that you want to roll out have teeth because you've got people behind them and they trust you, they know you, and you're credible, and they're going to deliver for you if you do it right on the communication side.
I agree. And John, if you go back, that's all great points. I mean, if you go back and you look at the history of advertising a business, right? We used to advertise a business and we'd say, I sell this product, come here, right? And then over the years, marketing developed. Marketing began creating brand association for guests or consumers. I like Apple because it makes me feel young or whatever. I don't know. I get an iPhone. But now the next evolution of that seems to be, to your point, it's the staff have to identify with it. We can't command it anymore. We can't say, give hospitality because that's your job. It doesn't work that way anymore. The workforce doesn't behave that way. Our trainers can't go in and just simply say, we're going to train you a great guest service program and they will do. They don't. You would hope back in the day that if you're paid, you work hard and you will get paid and you do what they say, but staff want to identify with what you're doing now. They want to be part of it. So that evolution from advertising to marketing has now hit home into our employment ranks, and your business apostles is spot on. If you don't have folks that are buying in or don't understand what you're doing, or you rush them to market, brand's going to fail. It's just not going to work.
Right. Right. Yeah, I agree. And look, it's simple stuff, and it's really not, it's not that complicated. It's just about being out there, being visible, talking to the people, understanding what they want to do, and you get some great ideas. I mean, ultimately, they're the ones that are, we call it square wheels, and the square wheels are, if you got a wagon with square wheels on it, it's not going to go anywhere, right? So the square wheels that are out there are the hurdles that they have to jump through to deliver service, and also the customers that they're jumping through the same hurdles. So we start looking for what are the points of dissatisfaction? What are we creating that makes our customers jump through hoops when they don't necessarily have to? And when you start identifying those and pushing those out of the way, guest experience is better, team member experience is better, and it's just driven by good communication.
And how do you specifically gauge that your communication strategy is successful? How do you know you have that 51% of employees on your side, that you have those business apostles? How do you're getting more customers in the door and they're staying longer? How do you know you're communicating successfully?
Well, personally, what we do is I'll do a survey generally twice a year, and the survey is the exact same questions. It takes 30 to 40 questions, and it drives them into 4 or 5 categories, and that's a really good barometer. And then we leave some open-ended opportunities as well in that survey to let them, it's interesting. I was expecting all this negative stuff in the first survey that we did, and we got a bunch of really good constructive criticism, great ideas. People are, they're passionate about. If you're passionate about it, they're gonna feel that energy and they're gonna go along with it. And I'm telling you, we've already done our second survey and we've already seen the results of that, where our scores have gone up. It's incremental. It's a few percentage points, but it tells me that it's starting to work. And as we continue to grind on this and really make it happen, continue to add different ways to communicate with the team, that score is going to go up. Now you've got a myriad of other scores, right? It's like, do I like my job? Am I being well trained? Do I trust my manager? There's also, those factors that are out there as well that can create a either positive or negative overall impact on the employees. So all of that's great data. We have a plan to do. You talked about service training, and the biggest failure of service training is trainers come in, they train for a week, everyone's good for 2-3 days, and then they just go back to their old routine. We've got a nine-point program that we're going to be rolling out in October that goes from benchmark measurement to training to accountability, to tracking, to what's in it for me, and then ultimately it becomes part of their annual evaluation. So it's an 8 to 9 point plan that actually sticks. To make a plan that sticks, there's got to be something in it for the employee. There's got to be a bonus, and that's what we do. It's a small bonus, $50 a quarter, but for somebody that's making $8, $9 an hour, that's an extra night out with the wife or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, that's really, in fact, a cultural change within the ranks. It takes time. You're changing human beings' approach. I worked here. I did this. Back to my example, I sold hot dogs. Now I'm selling steaks, and it's a big ask. There's a lot of heavy lifting for those staff to pull through. Managers want to manage. They aren't, always, particularly in restaurant business, managers are oftentimes and I'm in it, so I can say it, but we're sometimes we have the brigade command, we get the kitchen-esque, this is how it's done mentality, and that doesn't work. That flies against the other comments we were sharing about how employees relate to the workplace these days. So we really have to change that. Josh, you saw that recently in some of your projects, I know.
Yeah, I think it's important, the communication you have with the employees, but also the repetition and the consistency in what you're doing. The employees play such a key part in the decision-making process that, and John, you hit it well. You have to keep them informed. You can't leave with that empty suit, I think, is a very important point, because you can't put out promises that you're not going to deliver on, especially if you're garnering that feedback from those employees who are out there in the front line dealing with your guests. They have great, valuable information, and I think all too often that information is overlooked at times, and we need to utilize it when we're working on these projects.
Yeah, and Josh, this is Michael again, from a marketing perspective, a very wise guy told me early on in my career to not make promises in the media that I can't deliver on the floor. And the people that we're expecting to deliver these things on the floor may not have any idea what you're promising on a billboard or television or whatever. What I like to remind them is where they're working. This is probably the only playground in the world where the look on a server's face can cost us $20,000. I can't think of another business where you're not seriously serving a drink. You are not serving a chicken wing. You're providing an experience for a guest that you have no idea what their value is by looking at the way they dress. You can't tell a Tier 1 player from a Tier 9 player. You have to treat them all like Tier 1 players. And communicating your marketing message down to those frontline people, it makes a world of difference, because I've always said my best advertiser is the one walking across the floor with a badge on.
I think a great example of that, I was down in Mississippi, and we had this billboard in town that said, X Casino delivers the greatest service, in the history of man. It was just over, glowing, we give great service. And then you go to the property, and it's flat, nobody's engaged, nobody's making eye contact. So you got this complete disconnect between your marketing message and what you're just talking about is the marketing message and the actual experience when they get there is so disconnected that it's just it's almost laughable how that
makes the claims simple. Executing on it is difficult.
It's a bit like turning the Queen Mary. None of this happens fast. I wish I could snap my fingers and fix all these ills, but it's been ingrained in the property over a very long period of time for the last 10 years at least, and it's not going to change fast, and you got to be patient and just keep pushing on it, because eventually you'll get there.
Well, we are there. We unfortunately only have a few minutes left. This has been an excellent, informative conversation, but I'm sorry to report we are going to have to conclude in a few minutes. What I am going to do is ask that each panelist think about, what do you hope all attendees who are listening in will take away? From this conversation? What's the one thing? We covered so much. Data is king. Be sure that your decision making is based on the data that you're seeing. You must get your project team on board so that they're viewing food and beverage as a revenue generator, and that marketing is on board and that they understand it, because you have to work so collaboratively. You have to set realistic timelines and honestly explore brands. And then once you've nailed down the details, you've got to communicate that to your key stakeholders. So I'm going to ask each panelist to leave us with a brief thought of what you think the key takeaways should be for anybody listening into the panel today. Mike, would you like to start?
Sure. I would say, use your data, be disciplined once you've made your decisions, and, stay your course. There will be times that you'll have a myriad of opinions that you're going to have to contend with. Stay the course. You've got to stay disciplined through the process to make it happen. That said, make sure you have all the stakeholders at the table early on, as early as possible, to avoid excluding anyone who has valued information.
Fantastic. Michael, what's your key takeaway?
Well, my key takeaway is that F&B is no longer an afterthought. It's a part of the overall revenue process of the casino. And so if you're one of those marketing guys that wants to sit around and count slot chairs all day and do that kind of thing, that's wonderful, but you have a whole other department over there that needs to produce revenue, so we have to pay attention to it. So what I like to tell my clients is let's move away from a player development mentality and move into a guest development mentality, because there is an opportunity for high-spend, high-margin guests that don't particularly care for spinning cherries and sevens.
Great, excellent point. John, turning it over to you. What's your key takeaway?
Well, I'm going to go back to open the channels of communication, make sure that you're not the empty suit, and listen to your team, listen to the frontline employees and your customers, doing focus groups and doing internal focus groups. Both of them are very powerful, and you can get a ton of information that's actionable.
Great. And Josh?
Yeah,
what do you hope?
The understanding that it doesn't change overnight. There's a lot of different moving parts. There's a lot of people involved, and while these plans are put into place, it's not an overnight change. There's lots of moving pieces, and we need to be realistic in understanding how long that takes and timelines that are set.
Wonderful. So as a final point, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Ducey. How do we take the next step to project management? We've talked about investing in a program, developing a program, and how do we take that next step to project management?
Yeah, I appreciate that, and we're going to talk about that a lot in our next webinar. And Josh, did a nice recap there to kind of move into that with the time it takes. And I think that, in our next session, we're going to talk a lot about those particular topics. I mean, that's a good hour worth of discussion of the realities of the operations and how long it can take to really drive through a process from the decision-making phase that we've talked about in our last two discussions to getting operators, trainers involved in the discussion of how it actually comes together and the pitfalls and the challenges that are faced that we have to identify, that we need leadership to understand, we need ourselves to understand, and how we navigate those pieces. It's a really fun discussion. It's one that I enjoyed, but it is an immense part of the project. Serving food is not just simply putting food on a plate. There's a lot more to it than that.
Great. Well, that concludes our webinar for this afternoon. Oh, I guess this morning / afternoon. John, Michael, Josh, Mike, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I think we came at this from very different perspectives, and we all learned a lot collectively. Just a housekeeping item, we'll be posting this webinar on the Spectra YouTube channel, so you'll be able to access that in a couple of days. So if you want to kind of relive the conversation and pull out some key points for yourself, and then there will be in the coming weeks an invitation sent to all attendees to part 2, an invitation to part 3, so that we can hear the team talk a bit about implementation through project management. So thank you very much and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Blair.